Paul Mair, one of our favorite sources on this channel, is the author of one of the most comprehensive compilations of the medieval German martial arts, covers a wide range of weapons, including longsword here, but all of those weapon forms finally has been published with full transcription and translation. So today, to celebrate, we're going to be doing a look at Paul Mair's longsword, specifically one of the 5 master cuts, Zwerchhau.
Paul's Mair, number 3, the Thwart cut from both sides. When you come to the opponent in the onset, stand with your right foot forward so that your short edge is turned toward you. Follow up on your left leg and cut into the thwart with crossed arms. If he parries this, then wind onto his foible and cut long into his upper opening. Now, if you have your left foot forward and lie also against him in the thwart with crossed arms, then follow up with your right foot and turn your hands so that you have the flat of your sword toward him and cut in against him into the thwart at his left ear. If he parries your thwart, then execute a double failure and cut to his scalp on his right side.
Hey everybody. Before we jump into the formal interpretation walkthrough, I wanted to actually raise a couple of sort of important points as far as the original historical text goes. So you'll see that on the screen we've put text that includes the original, meaning not the transcription, but the English translation of the original historical text. And there's some additional color coding. Something that we've done previously, that every time that we've done additional work with Paul Mair, both with Zwerchhau and with the pretzel technique. So quick note there as far as the color coding goes. Green sort of indicates any of the text where it's basically things that are text that we have inserted for clarification. And doing it because we believe that these are sort of key ideas that Paul Mair actually did not specify, but are things he left out because it's assumed knowledge. It's assumed by someone with his experience that if he's talking to somebody else with similar experience, you should be able to fill in those gaps. So this is us filling the gaps, and the green indicates that we're not just kind of randomly putting in things just to make the technique work. They are things which we feel are consistent with the way that we approach the system as a whole, consistent with our fundamentals on how the system should work. So green is good, means, it feels like, we can fill it in with natural actions that we would take within the system. Things which are yellow are things which are more in question. And so in this particular case, we're going to have a couple of things where we call out things that are either unclear as far as the text itself goes, or where it's unclear in terms of our own certainty with the interpretation. So we'll get to those in a little bit. Okay, so as I look at the text, and as a quick reminder, where to get this stuff, it's coming from this source, which just came out this past week for publication and for purchase. So if this is something you'd like to get your hands on, you actually can. Check the description, link in the description below if you want to go ahead and pick this up. Will be, within the book, you've got things like this. And in particular, some of the things that we want to call out here are related to the footnotes. So those footnotes are actually part of the real value out of the book, going through not just doing a clean translation of the material, but also really collating, sort of pulling together. There's three different versions of this manuscript, one in Vienna, Dresden, Munich. They are not always consistent. And so pointing out differences between them occurs in the footnotes, as well as when there are differences between the German and the Latin versions. Calling those differences out is also down there as well. So speaking of which, okay, let's talk about the green text. So I think the things that Paul Sector Mair is leaving out that you should know are the very first thing that we're adding in here. If he parries this from above with a Krumpau or crooked cut, right? So we've talked about this before, where a lot of the time when the German sources talk about parries, they don't say which one. And so I think a lot of people sort of tend to throw in static, coming to a stopped position type of parry as default parries. And I think those are legitimate parries, but from if you have to start with a default parry, from my experience looking at various sources, I think it is very well worth thinking about crump as a default defense to try. Because not only does it actually put you in sort of a non-standard plow or ox kind of position, but it also gives a dynamic. It's a moving parry. It's a dynamic parry, and again, very very consistent with the way that we approach a lot of how we're moving in the system, which is in motion rather than start stop, these sort of discrete actions. So keep that in mind when we actually look at the interpretation. Everything's being done dynamically. We're almost never coming to a stop. So that is the first piece as far as the addition of that green text. The sort of remaining pieces of green text are just clarifications where, again, he's sort of describing an action, whether it's an attack or it's a defense, but he's not necessarily calling out exactly what those ending positions are. And so at the end of that first paragraph, if you cut in long to his upper opening, we're being specific by saying that we believe it's Zwerch with uncrossed hands. And then, that immediate next transition, when he presumably speaks to the other person who's responding as a defense, that transition is a transition where, if you look at the original text, it looks like that person is already there for no particular reason. And I think it's actually a position that is transitioned into from doing a parry, right? So, so at this point, hopefully this gives you an idea of the kind of things we've inserted and why. And hopefully it'll all make sense, actually, when you take a look at the interpretation. And at the end of the day, do not forget the title, right? The title of the technique is the thwart cut from both sides. And just like when we did the crump version, we found that, the title's true in the sense that for crump, we were doing crump on, a right crump for one person and a left crump for the other person. So that was how the title was true for Krumpau. You would kind of hope for some parallel behavior here, and you kind of get it. So if you think about the crump situation, there's a right crump for one person and a left crump for the other person. It's not each person does crump on both sides. However, in this case, I think that is what's happening. So you've got a more aggressive Zwerch thwart that you're throwing with your hands uncrossed, and then a more defensive hands crossed Zwerch on the other side that both people are throwing. So even though it is a different way of doing, thwart cut from both sides relative to the crump from both sides, the title is still being adhered to. So again, keep that in mind. I think it's really worth thinking about, when they say both sides, what do they mean? Okay, so those are all sort of like good clarification pieces. Here are areas where things are unclear, right? Things where I would say there's gray area, there's room for uncertainty and probably improvement when it comes to interpretation. So I'm going to call out three pieces. There's three bits of yellow text. There's in the first paragraph, cut long into his upper opening. Let's just start with those. That we'll go through each one here. So if you had the footnotes from the book, the Latin does not say long. It actually says with the long edge. And an important thing to note about the the relative different manuscripts as well as the German versus Latin. Again, these are assumptions, but to the best of our knowledge, Dresden was the earliest, Munich was the next in the sequence, and the Vienna was the latest and sort of greatest. So when it comes to actually sort of comparing sources, you would generally, as a starting point, tend to assume the Vienna is the most current and most accurate. And then relevant to this, when it comes to Latin versus German, probably not too much of a surprise. You would generally sort of assume that, since German is the native language here, hopefully that is the one that you would trust more. If there are instances where there are inconsistencies, as is, I think, in this case. So here, the text is talking about cutting long into the upper opening. And I do think, when you kind of put everything together, I think it actually is with a Zwerch with uncrossed hands, which typically would be with the short edge, not with the long edge. So I do think when they're talking about cutting in long, I think that is a, extended cut, reaching forward, not with the long edge, which is that's what the Latin says. The Latin actually says with the long edge in place of where it just says long. So again, there's an inconsistency there. We're making a choice and saying that we think the Latin is probably not accurate. Similarly, let's talk about the second failure piece. I think this is an honest area of opportunity for further understanding. So when they talk about failures, so the German term is F-E-L-E-R, failure, which has been translated in this project as failure. You can also translate it probably as feint. It's a deception, right? So the idea, for instance, if someone is actually cutting crump at you, say alternating crumps on both sides, you can be throwing zorns with a running off pattern, right? And by doing that, when they get close to doing a crump, you can actually run off with that zorn before they actually touch you and get over to the other side very quickly. And you can actually do two of those in a row. That would be considered probably a double failure, a double feint. And if you try that, it works very well for someone who's actually using crump as a defense. What's tricky here is, what do they mean by second failure? So I can throw out some theories, but at the end of the day, where we ended up with this was you're going to throw two Zwerchs, and the idea is that the first Zwerch was actually a failure, and then the second action is intended to hit. And so when they say second failure, it's almost as interpreting that as, I failed on the first action, I feinted on the first action, and I'm trying to hit with the second action. So it's a little bit funny in terms of the language, but it's maybe thinking about it as I'm going to hit with the second action, my second action after a failure, that double failure. I'm not totally sold on that. But again, I think in context with everything else, I think everything else hangs together pretty well. And so I think it really kind of falls down to maybe we need a better understanding of how to interpret not just failures, but what a double failure is. If it's a second failure, if it's a second action after an initial failure, who knows? But it's definitely good food for thought. And then the very final thing is, at the very end when it says right side, the Latin literally says left. And given that it's fortunately sort of at the very end of the interpretation, I could make it work either way with right or left. So it doesn't have a ton of impact. But just calling out that, again, there's differences between the German version and the Latin version. German says right, Latin says left. And again, if I have to choose, I would go with the original German, which I do think is more consistent. So again, now that you have that context, and feel free to go through the full walkthrough that follows this, and then come back so that like this hopefully makes a little bit more sense in terms of context. But yeah, if you want all of that context, this book now available for purchase, and the first of more volumes to come. So just Longsword, but even just getting through the first 5 master cuts in this is really valuable, I think. Lots of things in here that Pulse Hector has that we really don't see anywhere else, and also being able to make sense of it is a journey in and of itself that is super valuable, and I think speaks to how much more potential we have to learn from other sources in the German tradition. Okay, so on to the formal walkthrough.
Okay, so let's continue to kind of talk through this here. So with Pulse Hector Mair, there's I think there's going to be years and years of opportunity for us to kind of get deeper into understanding and better, better cleaning up a lot of these interpretations. We're going to go through this again, and I'm going to kind of point out different elements in here where, like, I think there's definitely uncertainty. But the big takeaway is to not necessarily focus on the uncertainty piece, but what are the pieces that we're pretty sure of that have like real value? Like, what is it that you wouldn't necessarily think of naturally today with like just the way that a lot of like conventional HEMA people think? So one of those really key ideas, I'm going to have Sam come back in here in a second to talk about the blade orientation here. So if Sam, come on in. So we're going to see situations where we're going to do basically effectively spherics on both sides. And if you remember, this is one of the big lessons learned with Pulse Hector Mair. Don't forget the title. The title of this technique is Pulse Hector Mair's Zwerchhau from both sides, right? The crooked, not the crooked cut, but the thwart cut from both sides. So so what you can see is there's a spheric to this ear first, right? And we get into this position. And by the way, I think that picture, the picture is effectively before we kind of get into the engagement. So we kind of both start with the left ox kind of situation here. And when he cuts into that right ox, there's this sort of arrangement where I've got left ox that's going to come on top. So uncrossed hands against crossed hands, that position is pretty core to what's happening because we're going to switch back and forth, okay? So when he does this and he cuts over here, now I get on top, and in some sense, if he's not in a good position, I can actually hit him with that spheric, but also when he's sort of coming here, he's attacking and can hit me with the spheric. So sort of spheric countering spheric. So here's the really key idea. A lot of the time, when we think about, okay, here's a spheric, maybe it hit, maybe it didn't, but if he wants to spheric to the other side, most people, the other side of the head, if he wants to go to a different target, the thought would be to go around the blade, right? Almost everybody's going to think that automatically. And this is where I think Pulse Hector is adding like a really good example of don't go to the other side. What happens if you stay on the same side? A super critical idea that we're actually, I think, going to see brought up again in other examples. Pulse Hector Mair, Joachim Mair, I can think of a few examples. And it's super important because they don't tell you, right? This is a really key idea. Like we've done examples of Pulse Hector Mair, other techniques, his crooked cut, and also, if you recall, the sort of pretzel technique that we've talked about in the past with like some wrestling stuff. Those are passages from Pulse Hector Mair that we have been able to sort of do interpretation on, and there have been lessons learned. Things like, hey, we got to fill in things he doesn't talk about, and also he may not be explicit about when he changes who he's talking to. All sorts of things where we need to know how to actually interpret and actually either fill in gaps or interpret things correctly. So in this particular case, the new piece here is he doesn't necessarily tell you when he switches targets what side of the blade to actually stay on. It's not always go to the other side of the blade. Could be stay on the same side of the blade, meaning, so when he cuts over here and I do this, when he cuts over to this other side, he actually stays on the same side, and in sort of like conventional HEMA understanding today, people would think of this as a duplaren. I think it's a duplaren, right? So he's doubling behind my blade, and I think one of the things that also makes this work, you're going to see that we do some circling here. As he circles, like it is like he puts himself into an advantageous position. It's not that easy for me to just hit him behind his sword. So from here, then it makes sense for me to do this. And again, notice uncrossed hands, crossed hands, right? So from here, what we can start doing now is actually, I'm in the same position that he was a moment ago and vice versa. So from here, I can again kind of flip open and try to get here. And all of a sudden, hey, we've got this funny little flow drill happening. Okay, boom. And also notice the kind of footwork that's necessary to make this stable, okay? So that particular sort of blade arrangement is sort of a really extreme version of something that we're going to be talking about in other contexts. For instance, Joachim Mair's winding cut, but also we've already effectively seen it when we think about Aufstreichen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you where we've hopefully kind of seen it previously, presented it previously, and see how it basically connects to all the way up to this sort of like extreme duplaren Zwerch version. So if we're doing Aufstreichen, where he's cutting from his right, this, yep, and then, yep, continue the pattern, yep, boom, right? So Aufstreich. So here, so go really, really slow so people can see this transition. So from here, when I attack, instead of just doing like a Zorn, I'm actually going to go here. So normally he would have been perfectly safe against this. Do the hands low, short edge up version. So here, he's perfectly safe against a Zorn, but if I know that he's maybe not bringing his tip up super fast or super high, I can actually kind of cheat and come over, and I can actually kind of shoot over and threaten him potentially. Right, forcing him to do this, right? And all of a sudden that puts us into that position that we basically have been doing with the Zwerchhau, right? So the Zwerchhau is basically our Zorn, Aufstreichen drill, again, so which looks like this. And we can certainly circle with it. Yeah, boom, 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 boom. And you'll notice, like, as we start doing more and more of that, we don't necessarily come off the blade. We can actually wind on it. Again, effectively, Joachim's winding cut, which we'll talk about in future videos and weeks. So hopefully, there's other things that certainly can be talked about with uncertainty here. There's things like the text mentions double failure. I think there's more to be learned there in terms of how to do feints here. And I think it's kind of referring to this idea of if Sam here is throwing, I'm going to throw Zorns, okay, alternating Zorns, and he's going to crump me, right? So when I throw Zorns and I'm doing a running off version, right? So in terms of failures, feints, we could be talking about that sort of thing. So that's a feint where I come very close to letting him parry, but I run off before he actually can get it. And that makes him basically fall behind in time because he has to chase me. And I can do a double failure where I actually throw one, throw a second one, and get him really far behind on time. So that could be what he is talking about. And there are other things, little things in the text where it would be great to really kind of lock down certainty on type stuff. So this is the sort of thing where, like, we're going to continue basically playing with this in class and in fencing, obviously, just in general, just to see if we can actually make more sense out of Paul Hector Mair's text specifically. But again, big thing, I think, takeaway is, hey, when you are cutting from one side to the other on your opponent's targets, consider the idea of actually staying on the same side of the blade rather than automatically switching to the other side. And in fact, also consider that when you're looking at interpretations. Are there times when you're assuming that that's happening? What happens if you don't? Does that change the interpretation in a significant way, which might actually be a better match to what they're trying to say? So I think that's good enough for today. And yeah, we'll be coming back to Paul Hector Mair and certainly in other examples, other techniques from the longsword section and other weapon forms eventually. And similarly, we'll also be looking at Joachim Mair and even earlier sources like Ringek in a little bit. This was actually a bit of a divergence from what we've been looking at recently with Alstreichen, but actually definitely still within the same family of we're effectively doing these defenses from below. So this is kind of like an Alstreichen against a very extreme committed attack from the outside, this Duplaren, which is basically in the form of a Zwerch. Okay, so yeah, so next time you think about Zwerch, think about the fact that you could actually do this in a way where you actually get some winding in here too. Pretty interesting way of looking at Zwerch that I think I certainly is pretty new to me, so hopefully it'll be new to other people. All right, see you guys next time.